With the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, destroyed tanks have been popping up constantly. In around a month of fighting, reportedly hundreds of tanks have been destroyed so far. This has led to tons of videos being made proclaiming that the tank is dead, that it's outdated as a concept. This often happens with modern conflicts, and I've talked about this topic before, but it's important to reiterate. You guys liked it when I invited Thinky on to talk about cope cages, so I figured I would do that again. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, it seems like in modern conflicts, like in Syria, Azerbaijan, people always see these tanks being destroyed left and right, and they think that means it's the end of the tank. Like, the tank is done for as a concept. And can you explain why people have a sort of misconception of what a tank is supposed to be or how it's supposed to function?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the blame for this is sort of a general or public perception of tanks in general. Sort of, I guess, a running term you could say is that tanks are not very tanky. This sort of Hollywood image, which romanticizes tanks as these invincible killing machines, which can just roll across a field and be taking hits from every imaginable anti-tank weapon, that's simply a fiction. These types of vehicles do not exist. As it turns out, tanks are actually incredibly vulnerable vehicles. It is fairly easy, especially for modern tanks with modern optics and fire control systems, it's fairly easy to knock a tank out of action, or to mission kill it, or to degrade its fighting capability such that it can't use any of the more modern systems available to it. This idea that tanks are supposed to be indestructible, it's false. Tanks have never been indestructible, and likely they never will be. There will always be counters to tanks, and there will always be vulnerabilities in them, but that does not degrade or that does not diminish the role and the function that they serve on the battlefield, which, depending on the army, is to support a combined arms team or to exploit weaknesses in the enemy front line. And that mission and that objective has not changed.
And I think it's worth mentioning that with all of these new fancy counters like drones and top attack munitions, any new weapon system takes time to develop a counter for, whether that be doctrinally or technologically.
Yeah, and this sort of counter that we see to any new generation of tank or an old generation of tank, this is not a new phenomenon. We've seen tanks being overmatched in their protection by new advanced weapon systems really for decades at this point. It just depends on the era we're looking at. Sort of an example that I would like to give is the advent of modern chemical effect munitions and recoilless rifles in the 1950s. In the 1950s, you still have, for service tanks, homogeneous steel armor, being pitted against modern chemical effect charges, or relatively modern. These weapon systems, things like the SBG-9 or the B-10, completely overmatched any armor that was available to modern main battle tanks of the era. Things like the M48, or later the M60. That doesn't mean that these tanks or the tank concept was useless or obsolete. It just means that you suddenly have to change the doctrine and the manner in which you are employing or using these tanks so that they aren't constantly defeated by those weapon systems. For things like the M48 and M60, you have the advent of coincidental rangefinders, which can extend the capability and accuracy of long-range fire support for these vehicles, which generally puts them out of the lethal range of these recoilless rifles or low-pressure cannons. So it's not that the tank is obsolete, it's that you need to devise new and more effective ways to defeat or to counter the counter to your tank.
And for a lot of these, counters already exist and have existed for quite some time, like active protection systems, drone jammers, lasers, SHORAD. These exist and they've been used for quite some time. It's just that in Ukraine they're not being utilized to their fullest extent.
And these arguments that we're hearing, that the tank is obsolete, these statements are very reminiscent of what we would hear 50 years ago during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where you had Israeli armor mounting these large counteroffensives against Egyptian positions and being defeated or destroyed by the advent of new, more advanced weapon systems. The sort of pinnacle of these two being more advanced RPGs, and the Malyukta anti-tank guided missile. Both of these proved very effective against Israeli armor, at least initially. But we didn't say that the tank was obsolete then, and we continued to use them in their intended and in new roles. What we did is we just adapted how you fight that kind of threat. And in this case, what you do is you suppress enemy positions. You use artillery, use fire support, use whatever assets you have to suppress, defeat, or kill the enemy anti-tank guided missile team or the RPG team, therefore allowing your tank to move without being hit by these weapon systems. And I think a very similar thing to that is going to be seen with Ukraine, that the way you defeat these weapons is not by bolting on even more armor, it's by improving or changing your doctrine and how you fight them.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that would be comparing American M1 crews to Iraqi M1 crews. I'm sure everyone's seen videos of Iraqi M1s with their blow-up panels going up in flames, you know, being hit by RPGs left and right, getting destroyed by IEDs. And yeah, if you employ a tank incorrectly, it's going to get destroyed pretty easily. It really comes down to how you use it, both as a crew member and doctrinally. You have to support it correctly and you have to use it correctly. In Ukraine, you're not seeing a whole lot of that.
Yeah, and to further the point that you mentioned with the Iraqi Abrams and compare that to the American Abrams, you know, the American crews, especially in Operation Desert Storm, were well disciplined and well trained, such that they kept to the doctrine, relatively speaking, and they were communicating and coordinating closely so that you have the ideal situation where you have infantry, armor, artillery, you know, all these supporting assets and all the logistics behind them constantly in contact and in coordination with each other. And that is really the reason why they suffered so little losses in Desert Storm. And that isn't to say they didn't suffer losses. They did, but it was fairly minimal in comparison. And that, I think, highlights something that I think is very important, is that these vulnerabilities, this untankiness, if you will, is not unique to Eastern or Russian armored vehicle designs. It is something that is endemic to all armored systems. I don't care if it's a Leopard 2, an M1 Abrams, all of them are very vulnerable weapon systems if employed incorrectly. And if you do that, you're going to suffer major attrition of your armored fighting force. It isn't a question of how good your design is, it's a question of how you're using it. And that really is the reason why these T-72s, T-80s, and such are taking large and excessive, depending on who you ask, losses into Ukraine. It's not because they're terrible vehicles or that they are completely incapable of fulfilling the mission of a tank. It's because they are being used improperly, or that the doctrine they are being used in is too inflexible to counter these more advanced or more capable weapon systems.
So I think that clears some things up. If you guys want to see more videos like this, let me know. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.